I think it's good to do a little level setting to start our conversation when we talk about integrative learning. One, it's in our office title, but also more so what we mean by it on our campus. And I think if you were to Google the term integrative learning, you could find quite a few definitions. So I'll let you know that we lean heavily on AAC&U's definition and really helping students to make connections between what they learn within courses and their involvement beyond the classroom. So for example, you might see examples of more interdisciplinary definitions, but we really know that we have a robust co-curricular and beyond the classroom environment here at the university and across our other system campuses, and we really want to leverage that to think about how students take what they learn in the classroom and apply it in other settings, or potentially even vice versa. As we know, learning happens really everywhere. So what they're learning beyond the classroom and then also taking this back into the classroom setting. So for those of you that are maybe a little less familiar with the name of our center, we actually have recently changed that, and it's been about a year since we changed our name. It was formerly USC Connect. And USC Connect actually was our first quality enhancement plan, or QEP. And so we changed the name to better represent a more transparent view of what we do in our office, but also to really emphasize this growing experiential focus. Not only the integrative component, but also the experiential focus. And also because we are launching a new QEP as a full launch in fall 2021. And as we lead up to the SACS visit in March, we're really going to look closely at beyond the classroom engagement. We're going to build upon the first QEP, but really thinking about these high impact practices and also smaller scale engagements that students do throughout their career. Not necessarily integrated only at the end of the career, but throughout. And also to embed high quality reflection as part of that. And so we have a reflection model that I'll talk about a little bit later that will be emphasized through the QEP. And another layer is that we're also, while we are promoting experience by design, we do have a name, experience by design to all students, we're also looking at students that are less engaged and that experience achievement gaps compared to other student groups. So whether that be retention or graduation rates. So those student populations will include Pell eligible, underrepresented minority, transfer students, male students, and even graduate students, which we're excited to include graduate students in the new QEP. So you'll probably hear a lot more about this as we continue to roll out our initiatives and where we're headed. But this will really tie in well with the center's mission, but also with this concept of integrative learning and these connections that students are making over time. So when we talk about experiential learning, I think it's also, since it's also in our title, let's break that down for what that means here at U of SC. So we do have criteria that undergird what our definition includes. And so that is significant time on task. And for us, that includes a minimum of 45 hours of engagement. And so that can include not only the time on task where the students are engaged, but also maybe some orientation or preparation training. Also the time that's included for them to reflect on the experience. So collectively, that is a minimum of 45 hours. Clear expectations. We know how important it is for students to understand what they will be participating in and what the criteria and expectations for success look like. And that can occur individually or through group sessions. Required reflection. You're going to hear that word a lot. We really want students to pause and make these connections that are so important to their personal development, but also their professional goal setting and those connections to their academic courses. So they can do that through assignments, and those could be the typical projects, papers, presentations, but also in the beyond the classroom setting or co-curricular, blogs or group sessions may be more popular. And then feedback. Again, so important for students to receive the feedback about how they're interpreting these experiences and how they're making meaning, and this iterative loop to help inform their learning moving forward. So these are the four main components for how we define experiential learning. And we do have opportunities for you to submit experiential learning opportunities to SEAL to go through a review process, and that's a recognition that students receive that we are really trying to promote. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later in the session. But this is how we define EL here. So you may be wondering what guides our definition or where we lean on. And we do look at best practices across the higher education landscape. And one is a big one called high impact practices. And for those of you in our field, this may be familiar to you. These are designed by George Koo, or are popular via George Koo, and provide some really good examples of what you probably are seeing across our campus. Here's some examples for you. So one, here at the institution, we have a very well-recognized first-year seminar, University 101. And so that, in essence, is a high-impact practice based upon the criteria. We also have this emphasis on study abroad or global learning, learning communities, which are so important, service learning, community-based learning, writing intensive courses, internships, capstone projects, research, undergraduate research. So as you could probably recognize these as being really hallmark experiences here, and also they are part of the work here in SEAL through our Graduation with Leadership Distinction program, the GLD program, where we emphasize these high impact practices. I want to emphasize, going back to GLD, a real new component to the literature about high impact practices, but something we're really excited about is this emphasis on e-portfolios. So for students pursuing graduation with leadership distinction, they do complete an e-portfolio product that's evaluated and scored and is part of this recognition process. So it's good to know that we're in good practice among our peers in terms of how we're producing really strong students and providing quality learning environments. George Koo also promoted some additional criteria to think about that align very well with our experiential learning criteria, but just lots of ways that we can think about how to make practices high impact in the work that we do. So hopefully this sets the stage for your own efforts and your own disciplines and your own work with students of how we can provide a robust quality experience consistently across our campus.
So this is a transition from what we've just presented to you. We recognize that, these concepts, these larger concepts of integrative learning, experiential learning, high impact practices in particular, if you look at that list, some of those look very comprehensive, right? Those are things that students aren't necessarily doing in a day. It's a more prolonged endeavor. And so to be true to our title, we really want to transition into, well, what kinds of small changes, what small things can we all do with our students that can then prepare them for or lead them to higher impact learning? So that's what this slide is intended for. And the way that I've broken this down is just to get you to think about what are some small changes that you can make, in particular in the classroom. And so for the rest of the presentation, we'll talk about within the classroom and beyond the classroom. But for now, let's think about what we can do in the classroom. And so I have 4 bullets, sub-bullets there, and I'll ask you to think about it this way. I know for our syllabus requirements in my department and in my college, we are asked to specifically identify interactions from student to instructor, student to student, student to content. Those are what we're asked to include in all of our syllabi. And I would encourage you to think about a 4th one, which is student to beyond the classroom, right? And so if you look at these 4 sub-bullets here, I think the small changes we can make are things that, for example, promote more meaningful dialogue between us as instructors and our students, right? So that's the student to instructor interaction. We can create opportunities, sometimes very simple and short opportunities for students to work with each other, both in and out of our classroom. So student to student interaction. We can certainly encourage and support student reflection. Again, that can be done during class, in the classroom, or after. So that's in line with that student to content interaction. And then my 4th and final one there is really what kind of small things can we do to help motivate and support students to engage in beyond the classroom. And so with that in mind, I'm going to transition back to talk about some techniques that we can use in classroom, techniques in particular, that are fairly small and easy to do.
Okay, so yes, I'll start the conversation by talking about classroom assessment techniques, or CATs for short. And here's what I will tell you. So for some of you, this term may be very familiar, and you see this and utilize this in your work. I imagine what also may be the case is that some of you are doing this work, but don't realize that it has a formal structure or name attached to it. And for some, this may be brand new, which is also great. And so that we could share some new insights. So this will we'll have a follow-up question for the group a little bit later about CATs. And so as this graph or this chart demonstrates, we really think about this as an iterative process, and that is what learning is, and that's what we really try to promote through GLD, graduation with leadership distinction, and that e-portfolio process. And so by doing these small experiences early in their career, then they can build that capacity and do it much better and later in their career, and scale it in a way that benefits them. So in this, we ask students, well, we plan our syllabi. We think about the assignments that we're creating, and we design these assessments in mind. And then we ask students through these assessments, through our tests, our quizzes, our assignments, what they're learning. We collect that information, and then we analyze the student understanding of that, and then we come back around to make change. Now that is on the broader scale. When we think about classroom assessment techniques, the great thing about that is that you don't have to design a lengthy assignment, or one of the toughest things I think about teaching is that we don't recognize whether the learning is happening until maybe a week or two later because that's how our assignment may be structured. These are really intended to be in the moment, a small scale classroom assessment techniques that give you a really good understanding of how well your lesson plan is being understood, of how students are making meaning of that information, and allowing them the opportunity to ask questions and raise points about the conversation. And so that's the great thing, that in real time you can adjust your lesson. Maybe you need to come back to it later in the following subsequent week, or you're ready to move on with the content. And so you can see on the left side of this slide what the benefits to students are. It really is a way to also reinforce learning. So, we have our lesson plan, and we know what we want students to have these as key takeaways, but we can also reinforce that through our CATs, our classroom assessment techniques. And that clarification that is so important, as we know. For you, it's always great to know that it's happening as it should be happening. And so this helps to reinforce that. And because it is formative, it really helps to give you insight early on without having to wait till midway through that midterm exam to understand what students are receiving or understanding through your course content. So it's a win-win. It really is a win-win for everybody in this process. So some examples, let's talk about it. Well, one, I want to point you to a great resource, one of my favorite books from Angelo and Cross, called Classroom Assessment Techniques. And CTE actually has a couple of copies of this handbook, which is great that we have a resource at the ready. I also know it's visible on Amazon as well. In case you're not quite ready to commit to that level, or you'd like to learn a little bit more, we're going to transition now to a website that we have found beneficial from one of our peer institutions. So this is out of University of Kentucky, hopefully not a rival, and we can think of them as a peer in this context. And they have their own, essentially their Center for Teaching Excellence. And so they have organized several of the CATs that are embedded in that Angelo and Cross textbook by category. So here at the top, we see if maybe you're trying to design a CAT, or you're really curious what students are knowing or understanding about prior knowledge, recall, about the content that you're presenting. So here's some examples of how that could be covered. A second category here is assessing skill and analysis and critical thinking. So some examples are some grids that you can do, this analytic memos. And I think what's great, and maybe is more emphasized more so in the textbook, is there's literally the how-to for all of these. These are great ideas, but you can dig further to understand how you would design that CAT. Excuse me. how to assess skill and problem solving, etc. These are great. Skill and application and performance. Yeah, all 50 right there for you. So just consider this as a way to kind of dip your toe into CATS to learn more, but really encourage you to use the resources at CTE to help with that. So I will point out a couple that I think are really great, and then I'll show one that I incorporate into the classes that I teach. So one is called Muddiest Point. So really, it's essentially you can do this electronically. You could do this through a flashcard. On one side, students respond what was the most unclear or confusing point, and then you take that information and you gather it at the end of the class, or maybe during your break. I know that I teach a graduate class and we have a break in the middle, and I collect those before the break, and then I understand what I need to cover or do differently later in the same session. You can also have students generate their own test questions, and that's a great way for them to have to think about the content and then translate that into a question that could be asked or probed further through a response. A pro-con grid, they can list cost benefits, pro-con, advantages, disadvantages of a societal issue, a question in your content. What a great way to help them really think about the multiple perspectives that can play a role into a concept. And then, of course, concept maps. So, this idea of visualizing what you're learning is a really great tool to help students really understand and deepen their content knowledge. So here's one that I wanted to mention called the 1-Minute Paper. So I currently teach a graduate course on higher education assessment in the Higher Education and Student Affairs program. And so one of the content areas that we cover is about learning outcomes. And so a question that I'll ask right before the break, that may be the first part of a course. It's about 2.5 hours. What was the most thing you learned thus far, and what question remains unanswered? And so I pulled some examples of what some of the responses have been from students. So the most important thing that they realized through the lesson was the importance of using the ABCD method. So it's helpful for me to know that the framework that I am emphasizing through the course is being received well, and students that like it and understand it. They also think it's important to understand that they have an appropriate assessment measure to be able to evaluate those learning outcomes. That's a relief to me because it's something that I try to stress. So it's good to know that what I'm emphasizing is being heard. And here's some unanswered questions. So it was really helpful for me to understand that there's still a question about what the difference between learning outcomes and programmatic outcomes. And that was like, okay, ding, ding, ding. That was a light bulb moment for me to say, okay, when we come back, I'm going to start the conversation right there. And then how many learning outcomes are too many to include? Which is a great question, right? I think us as educators, when we have developed learning outcomes, it's something really important to think about. And so what a great tool, and this has really guided my work in the classroom. And so I just wanted to share that as an example for you. Then it's pretty quick. And so what I am always clear to do, though, on the return is I really try to bring it back. Like I listened or I read your responses, and here's what I want to discuss as a result, or here's what I want to emphasize as a result. And I think students really do like that feedback loop part, that the students, that they're hearing what we're saying, or that we're listening to what they're saying and using that as part of improving our practice.
I think that's the $1 million question, right? Is, are students going to buy in when we do these things? And I really do think if it comes across as if it is an essential and integrated piece of your teaching, but most importantly, that you're using it to give them feedback, then I do believe, at least my own experience, is they will buy in to it. So I think that's critical. I did want to answer one question that popped up in the chat room. These really are designed. So his question is about, are these in class or more, assignment based, like homework assignment based? And I think the intention here really is to implement these live in the classroom with the students. That some of these you can certainly translate into out of class assignments, but the intention really is to do it in the room, I think. There was a question that says, is the iterative nature of classroom assessment what the CAT handbook is on.
Yeah, that is what part of what the handbook covers is how we really try to, yes, it's not a one-shot deal. We continually come back to it, and we emphasize that through our teaching practice, and also to emphasize that to students in their learning. Because that's one thing that I think we have learned a lot through the GLD program and the e-portfolio process, is that students will write content and they kind of have an underlying assumption that it's done or it's good enough. And it's really intended to be a feedback loop. And so they're going to get feedback on sections either through an instructor or an advisor. And students need to be prepared for that. And so and by the way, that's life too, right? Like in our own industries, we're in higher ed, but across many industries, that's how life goes, is that you get feedback and you're expected to make adjustments. So we want them to learn that skill early. And these are great ways to help emphasize that as well. Just a couple more comments I see. This is the beauty about cats, I think. I can fully say that I have tried a cat or two, and I do these often, so it's a small percentage. But I might say, well, I might not do that one in this way the next time. And guess what? It's such a small risk that it's fine. There is no harm in what you're doing. The students appreciate you trying to take their feedback, and that's the point. But you may adapt cats as a result of trying one and doing it again later. So I encourage everyone. It's a very low risk, but a big impact opportunity there. Great examples there. I have not found that graduate students find this to be sophomoric. I think that they appreciate, again, the time and place, and that they understand that I'm trying to improve practice within and make sure that they understand the content. And I also try to stress to them, they're going to be, many of our grad students will be leading classes, teaching classes in the near future if they aren't already. This helps getting them acclimated as a professional skill for them moving forward in the profession as well. So I think
there's also one about handling this in large classrooms.
Oh, yeah.
Is a great question. Mm-hmm. And there are resources available through CTE. I'll just mention, for me personally, I at least have reasonably large classes, 50 to 100 students for most of the courses that I teach in engineering. And I use these frequently, but I enable it with classroom response system. So Top Hat is one that I use. iClickers, of course, were one of the early technologies out there. So there's a lot of these kinds of resources that you can use. And quite frankly, even these days, simple things like polling questions that are available through Blackboard Collaborate Ultra, if you're using that for an online course. But I do think the technologies are critical, at least in my opinion, for the larger classrooms.
That's a really good point. I will, if you have challenge in the technology piece, I'll just share one that I think works really well in just about any setting is think, pair, share. We've all done that one. But if you're in a large setting, you can split students up to really purely pairs or maybe triads and have a discussion point, and then they report out, right? That's a cat. We all use that one, I'm sure, but that may be a way to help break that up. Technology is such a helpful tool here.
You are right. You don't need to use technology in a large classroom. So I want to be clear on that. And your example of using a think, pair, share is perfect, right? Because, all you really need are to get students together to talk with each other for a couple of minutes and then maybe have a few volunteer to share with the room. That's a great one. And I use that a lot as well. So.
Yeah, awesome. I think we'll transition on in just a second, but I wanted to come back to a great question. Seems to be some analysis of your own CAT process that should happen and really what's received well or works well with students. I think you could do a CAT of cats, right? And ask them their opinion, maybe at some juncture in the semester. You can maybe remind them, by the way, I do try to remind them we incorporate these things because, depending upon how your course evaluation is set up, often there are times there's a question there about feedback, right? And so not to, play to the evaluation, but more to just stress, hey guys, we are incorporating feedback where we can in the class, even in small ways, beyond the typical assignments. But I do ask them how well, which ones they liked, if they had any feedback. I typically don't do that after every time I incorporate it because I feel like that would be a little redundant. But there may be a couple of times in the semester where I do press pause and say, can we look at the last, 3 or 4 weeks and what we've done with cats, and any thoughts or what you would change up in that. I think also going back to looking at the quality of your responses will help inform. If students are taking it seriously enough to complete the task and putting in the time to put in depth to their response, I find that's a good indicator to me. And it's not to say that all cats require that. Some are much more like the polling option, but if you have some open-ended response cats, that to me is a good indicator. If they are really taking the time to provide that feedback, then they're probably getting a lot from it as well.
So let's move forward a little bit and talk more specifically about reflections. And so, I think it's important to remember that, how students reflect, when they reflect, where they do it. Is it in the classroom? Is it part of an assignment outside of the classroom? And most importantly, why are they doing it? All of that matters, right? So I think with student reflections, when this is something that you would like to embed in a course, you really do need to ask yourself the how, when, where, and why. What are you trying to do for your students? So there are a lot of different kinds of reflection activities available. What I have listed here actually just comes something that's discipline specific, although this is my go-to for engineering. There's a site that I utilize here, the CIPRI site, but I imagine this is very similar to any other discipline that you are in. So you really do need to think about, what do you want students to reflect on? Do you want them to reflect on specific content? Do you want them to reflect on course delivery, right? I mean, you could have them reflect on the use of cats, kind of like what we were just talking about. Do you want them to reflect on specific assignments? And so I know one of the things that came up in the chat room was, asking students to rewrite an essay prompt after writing the essay. I mean, that's a form of reflection and then proposing changes. I particularly like having students reflect on their exams after they get their exams back and their grades, and rather than just let them kind of hide it away in their binder or whatever they do with it, ask them to reflect on their performance on the exam, and did they prepare well enough, or what didn't they prepare for now that they see their scores, things like that. And so we could go through this full list, which I won't do, but again, the point being that you want to think about specifically what it is you want them to reflect on. So if I move forward, then of course there are a number of different assignments that you could prepare to engage students in reflection. And so of course, I put it at the top of the list simply because I think it's one that most people often think about, right? You associate self-reflection with journaling. And so that is certainly one that could be incorporated into a course. Goal-setting reflections, I've specifically underlined that because I'm going to share an example of one that I've used in a course. As I said before, maybe having specific assignments or prompts that ask students, for example, we just learned, this concept in class. How could you apply that in a real setting, in a, an application, a work experience, for example? So those are some ways of addressing bullet point 3, and again, so on and so forth. Projects that make connections across courses. I do think it's important to consider that reflection doesn't necessarily have to be in words. So drawings can be quite helpful as well. So concept maps is just an illustrative form of building on your learning through reflection. And one of the other ones that I've underlined here is problem-based learning, which is something that I use often in my engineering courses. So again, there's a number of different kinds of assignments you can use, and I'm going to talk about the 2 that I've underlined here. So the first thing that I want to mention is I think I might be the sole engineer in the workshop. And so I think it's really important to recognize, that all of these techniques I feel like are global. I mean, we can use them in any setting for any discipline. And so I'm going to share a couple of examples of things that I do in engineering courses, but I encourage you to think about how you might apply or borrow elements of these examples in your own discipline, in your own courses that you teach. And so I'm going to start with a within the classroom example of what I consider a high impact practice, largely because this is collaborative learning, which is one of those HIPs that was shown in the table, and how I incorporate student reflections with this. So this is something I teach in an introductory course for students in our major. So these are mostly first semester, first year students. And so a little bit more about this particular course. Even though it's an introductory course, it's not just, in fact, it's not really a content-driven course. It is more of a skills-driven course. And so we really want students to learn skills that they need, not only to succeed in college, but specifically as an engineering student. And so we emphasize that. We absolutely emphasize critical thinking skills. And to me, that's where embedding in these reflection moments are very important. And thirdly, again, in particular for this course, students are learning how to write a technical report that describes the solution to an engineering problem. And so again, I don't want to forget my quote, because I love John Dewey and his quotes, but you can see in the lower left-hand corner, we only think when we are confronted with problems. And so that's our entire course that we teach here is based around that premise. So let me explain this specific reflection assignment, if you will. So in this class, students have to write 2 or 3, sometimes 4 engineering reports, depending on the year, that, again, describe their solution to a problem, a real problem we posed to them. But the specific thing we include in here is not only do they write an engineering report, they have to write or include a lessons learned section. And so basically, we just ask them to say, okay, so you spent a couple of weeks working on this problem and trying to figure out how to solve it. What did you learn, right? What did you learn during this whole exercise? And so we encourage them to write those down as part of their report. And specifically, we ask them, okay, reflect on the problem-solving process. So again, that's one of the skills we're emphasizing here. So because that's important for our course, we want them to reflect on it and to share those reflections. And then we also ask them to consider very specific things they learned, like specific content pieces or concepts that they learned while they were solving it. So we want them to address that and say things like, oh, well, I kind of knew this concept before, but now I better understand it, and here's why. So those are the things that we're looking for there. And then lastly, I need to give you a little more context for this particular example problem. So when we say we want them to design a parking lot, that we actually ask them at the outset of this to say, okay, come up with a first best guess at how many vehicles you could fit in this space with an optimally designed parking lot. So what that means is they have to come up with an initial solution, if you will, or initial answer, and then they refine it by learning a series of things over a couple of weeks. So basically what we're asking here is to have them reflect on that. You had an initial number, now you have this optimal number with your final solution. Well, tell us how that number changed, and tell us why it changed and how it changed. So again, really getting them to think about their learning specifically. So one example of a lessons learned section that's incorporated in one of my courses. So let me switch to a second course. So I'm going to go from a first semester, first year course to a senior level, in most cases, their final semester course. This is a specific design course that I teach. And this is where I use goal setting reflections. And so the idea is that I asked students a set of 4 specific prompts over the course of the semester, and just ask them to be open and honest in their responses. I don't tell them, this is graded, by the way, it is a portion of their course grade to complete these, but I don't specify word counts, but I do tell them I expect a full answer to the prompts. So let me just show you what those look like. And I know there's kind of a lot of words here, but this first one in the first week of the class, and in fact, I've just done this in this course, I'm teaching it right now this semester. I just say, okay, brainstorm everything you think you know about this class. And then based on that, what are some skills that you have learned elsewhere in prior courses that you think are relevant? So again, the idea here is really getting them to think about connections between courses, right? Previous courses they've had, and how is that relevant to the course they're taking now? So that's what they do in their very first reflection. And then I follow that up in the second week with, okay, so you've thought about that, set some personal goals. Personal goals, things that you want to learn or take away from this course, right? And I've kind of emphasized here in bold that this is supposed to be completely separate from grades. This is not about their grades. These are about other goals that they have. So it could be things they specifically want to learn about content, of designing a foundation. It could be more broad engineering skills or professional skills. Like I said, most of these students are about to graduate, so they might be using this to prepare for a first real job. So those are the things that I'm looking for. And I will tell you that I learn a lot about my students through these reflections. So that's the first 2 weeks. The third one occurs roughly mid-semester. And simply all it's asking is, okay, you set these 3 goals at the beginning of the semester. How is it going? How are you doing? Are you making progress? Are you not making progress? Why? Why or why not? And so what I'm also sharing here, if you look at the second question that's in red, I used these reflections last spring in this same course, when of course we all had to transition our teaching due to the onset of the pandemic. And what that allowed me to do was to sort of embed that into this assignment I already had. And so I specifically added, you know, hey, by the way, this happened mid-March. So this was right about when we all transitioned away from the classroom to online. And I said, you know, how has this impacted your goals? Have you had to change your goals? And I will tell you, I had some fascinating responses from students about things had changed for them, and many of them got into how difficult this transition had been so far, so on and so forth. So again, I got very deep personal responses. And then the last one was really just the wrap up, right? It was sort of like, okay, you're at the end of the semester, you had these goals, did you make it? How did you do? And again, last spring, you know, I was able to very specifically ask them, you know, how well that went in light of what we had to deal with the pandemic. And so again, that generated a lot of very personal responses from these students. So these are some examples that I wanted to share, and I hope you can think about these as just a couple of examples and maybe translate them to your own courses.
So yeah, I'll talk a little bit about, for those of you who maybe work with students not in a course setting or in addition to the course setting. And so there's a lot of ways that you can incorporate CATs or other critical questions to students through these experiences as well. So for example, let's say students are involved in an alternative break or a service Saturday or even a service site over many months throughout the course of this semester. So in that, you could ask students to complete written reflections on how it's going. What's the progress like with implementing meaningful programming related to community issues? And what they're learning through that experience, and how they're being problem solvers, and things like that. So if that's a goal, and that's what you're really trying to understand about what students are gaining through the experience, the right side of the slide presents some ways that you could ask these questions. So, you know, one thing that we learned through the service learning literature is that, you know, students might have preconceived notions going into the community or the environment that they are being tasked with. So in what ways were their stereotypes or assumptions challenged? I mean, that's a real introspective question, but really helps to set the tone that there are multiple perspectives and that we learn by seeing and doing. What were their expectations did they have about the experience, and maybe how they were met or how they were adapted or changed over time. What was frustrating? I think that's a really great question to ask students. Sometimes we present that learning is linear and that it's clean and there's a point A to point Z and you'll get there. So, maybe the learning is frustrating. Maybe what they are experiencing in the environment is frustrating. But asking them to unpack that and really also how they handled it so they understand the steps that they completed to do that, I think is really important. Similarly, what was uncomfortable about this learning or this environment experience and how they handled it, and what surprised them. So you can see that these type questions don't just ask, can you name a concept from the experience and how you applied it? It really gets into some real critical questions that really will serve them well later professionally and personally, and really help them understand the depth of content in a way that is meaningful and impactful to them. So just thinking about whether it's in the course or beyond the classroom, how you can set up these reflection prompts in a way that really emphasizes that deep learning, I think is something we're spending time on it, and hopefully these examples are helpful to you.
Just one other thing I'll share quickly is when I did these goal setting journals in my senior civil engineering course, I was concerned at the beginning. I didn't know how my students would react to that. I think, again, most of our senior engineering students hadn't experienced much of that before, but I was willing to try it and wanted to see how it would turn out. And I'm raising this because I know there were some questions and comments earlier about whether students balk at this or if they feel like it's sophomoric or what the case may be. But I have to tell you that I was so impressed with how well these students took to these reflection prompts and were really willing to share with me their goals, and were fairly honest with how they were doing or not doing with achieving that goal or set of goals. So anyway, that's just another example of how I think things can work as long as you're willing to try them.
For those of you who are feeling, empowered and confident, we really do hope you try these. Just also be prepared that students often, what we've learned again through GLD is that students aren't asked to reflect as much in this early in their careers, and so they may struggle and really are unsure of how to respond. They may be thinking, and maybe they're not confident in a response, but being comfortable in that silence is important, and also how to role model, how to be good reflectors, I think is important. But just being prepared for how students may not be, really gung-ho or really prepared in the moment, because this may be new to them as well.
And I think that's where, sort of looking at the comment where she said being very transparent is important. Absolutely. And I will say, just going back to the goal setting reflections that I do, by the way, just so that you know, I utilize the journal function or feature in Blackboard. So that's how I do it. It's set up to support journaling, and that's where I do those goal setting reflections. But I will say, even when students are a bit uncomfortable with responding to those kinds of questions, which they are, some of them definitely are, it gives me the opportunity to provide some feedback, though. And I think that's the key piece is, when these students were responding to my prompts, I made sure every time, even if it was one sentence, I made sure to say something in response to them. And I also announced that in class, and I made it very clear that they need to go look at my feedback to their journal entries, because I had things to say and to share with them. So I think all of that transparency is important.
I just want to highlight there's some really great examples being shared in the chat box. I'm making a couple notes. I may be reaching out to a couple of you to learn more about how you incorporate this. But no, these are great. One I wanted to point out, I myself like to present content as through an issue statement or a problem statement and have the students go from there. I do find them having to work their brains in that way is helps to successfully elevate the content. So that is great. Yeah, just some themes. I like this kind of peer-to-peer component. I do find that one of the best learning strategies is to have to talk it through with a peer in the course. Really kind of innovation, photo voice, but also there's some other technology examples in here as well. Using great resources, the 7 Habits for Highly Effective Teams from Tim. Yeah, what a great setting the stage and then having them to go, apply that learning and then having them, I'm sure, unpack that to see if it actually emerged the way the book or the resource described it.
One other observation that I have, because I am certain that we have people in this workshop that perhaps haven't done much with things like CATs or reflection assignments. And, one thing I'm seeing, and thank you all for sharing this, is, how you're sharing students really liked it, students loved it, they want to do more of it. So this is evidence that these work. They definitely work. And again, as long as you are very clear with them why you're doing it and that it's intentional and that they should expect to learn from it, this is perfect. This is the way to sell it, I think, right? That your students do in fact tell you they like doing it.
I think what's really neat about all of the strategies that we've described, including STEM examples, is that you don't have to be siloed or pigeonholed into a certain type of CAT or reflection activity based upon your discipline. These are really intended to be spanning across so many methods and environments. So I think that's a lot to be said for this style of teaching, is that you can adapt it. And we encourage you to adapt. You observe it in one setting and try it on your own. But how beneficial is that we can have a toolbox like that?
And one follow-up suggestion, I think we're sharing a lot, but keep in mind, pick one thing, start small, do something that sounds like it's the easiest for you to do and incorporate it in your class and see how it goes. And, as we've shared, I think we all have to be a little willing to fail, that it may not work as well as we envision. That has certainly happened to me time and time again. But I'm also pretty open with my students, and if I think something isn't going well, I'll certainly let them know that, and we'll move on and we'll try something else. But yeah, start small. That's my suggestion.
Such a good point. I think, yeah, we have to be willing to be a little vulnerable in this. And as you can see, as a lot of the assignments or activities are designed, you may not be the expert in the room. You may know the content well, but how they are interpreting and receiving and learning, you have to be willing to take that on and kind of react and discuss it in the moment. I find that takes a little practice, because we are naturally the content experts for the disciplines that we represent. But some of this mode requires step back for a little bit and let the students really lead, which is beneficial and so impactful. But it does require some thought in that. I think we can all speak to that.
And one last comment, and then we probably should move forward. In a lot of STEM, delivery, these things are missing. And honestly, I feel they're essential. So, the more folks that we can have utilizing these kinds of techniques in STEM-driven courses, the better. So thanks for sharing that.
Just a reminder about this great resource that CTE has available to you. You can also order it off Amazon. And also, I think we have a decent community of practice here of people who are incorporating these, whether they were doing it formally or not, but are doing these things. So let's lean on each other. And also, of course, the website that I mentioned as a way to get started. I mentioned AAC&U early in the presentation and how we've really leaned on that definition of integrative learning. They have value rubrics established for many types of these kind of critical thinking concepts. Lifelong learning is one, for example. And so how you can maybe look at some standardization or even the terms of how things are being conveyed through AAC&U might be a real benefit to you and how you can bring that back to your discipline. And also, we mentioned high impact practices early, and so we actually do have a survey called the National Study of Student Engagement that is based upon high impact practices, the NSE for short. And so if you are ever curious, how are our students, it's self-report, it's a survey they do every few years out of our institutional research office, but how are students making or identifying these high impact practices? How many are they doing? What are their significant takeaways? I think this provides good insight to our campus. And one thing I will note is that now you can drill down within NSE. It's still an aggregate form, but if you're curious about by major or by academic classification, that may be beneficial to you and the students you're working with. So there's a link to the OIRA website and how you can find this information and request more in case you're curious. And it's a great, I utilize this resource to really understand contextually localized here on our campus how high impact practices and a lot of the great criteria that we've already described are being incorporated from the student perspective, how they're receiving it. Also, I mentioned very early on, that with the new QEP that we have identified a reflection model, and we've, as you have learned, we've talked a lot about reflection. And I want to iterate a couple of things. One, reflection, I think, has some interpretive nuance to it, depending upon your discipline and maybe your experience level and whatnot. We learned that through our own analysis of our first QEP, the USC Connect, as I described. So we are in the new QEP, Experience by Design, we'll be promoting a reflection model. And I want to make clear that this is not intended to be super prescriptive, but we want to provide a tool to people who are trying to really break down reflection and to describe it to your students in a way that makes sense and is logical. And so when we did our research on higher ed reflection models, the DEAL model readily appeared, and it's one we're excited about. So the DEAL stands for Describe, Examine, Articulate Learning, and it's out of Ash and Clayton and Service Learning Literature from 2009. So in this, you can see through this diagram that students are engaged in an experience. They are then charged with describing the experience objectively. And then we ask students through our prompts that we create to examine the experience through personal growth or civic learning or academic enhancement. You can even add professional growth in there. We're really, there's ways that you can contextualize the experience depending upon whether it's course specific or beyond the classroom, etc. And so we like this model because it leaves options on the table. It's not that it can only be related to personal or only academics, but it can be related to several and maybe more than one. And so you as the provider, as you as the instructor, can help make some decisions in that of how you want to frame the experience in that. And then, of course, we ask students to articulate what they learned based upon the prompts that we've provided to them. And what's nice about this model is that it demonstrates the iterative process of this. So you go back right around and you engage in the experience and you test that learning. What you thought you knew, did it actually play out that way in practice? And several of the examples shared, I know, use this type of thinking in their work as well. And so if you're looking for more literature or ways to talk about this with your students, I would encourage you to check out the DEAL model. And as a great maybe tool to help you moving forward. And they have a lot of resources, great articles, but also just how-tos. So yes, QEP is on the horizon. We have this focus on high-quality engagements and this quality reflection that accompanies it. And it's really intended for all students, but with the particular student populations that are less engaged and also are not as successful with retention and graduation as some of our other student groups. Just a reminder, those are Pell-eligible students, underrepresented minority, transfer students, male students, and we'll include graduate students as a way to help emphasize engagement and reflection for those students as well. If you think, based upon the criteria that we've discussed and a lot of the activities, that you have a high-quality engagement and you're curious to learn more about experiential learning opportunities, again, that's a recognition for students that goes on a record and a developing transcript. How cool is that for students to see that and for you to promote that. Check out our resources on our SEAL website. And also, we've mentioned the Graduation with Leadership Distinction program a few times.